Every Pokemon generation has some good and some bad in it. Even if it's your favorite gen, it's gonna have some not amazing stuff. And even if it's your most hated generation, it'll still have some good stuff worth enjoying too. And that's why today I'm gonna be covering what I think are the best and worst parts of every Pokemon generation. This is all my own opinion, so be sure to let me know yours as well in the comments, and with that in mind, let's get into it. So naturally we're going to begin with Gen 1, and I think the best thing about Kanto is its evil team. While there have been some great evil teams over the years, I think the OG Team Rocket is still the best overall. They have a great name, they have a great look and motive and goal. Giovanni is arguably the coolest evil team leader of them all, the twist of him being the final Kanto gym leader is amazing, and they even operated out of a shady casino that was used as a front for their operation. It does not get any more legit than that, and any evil teams that we see in the future are going to be hard-pressed to be as cool as Team Rocket, in my opinion. Meanwhile, the worst thing about Kanto, in my opinion, is admittedly no fault of its own, and that is that it is definitely the most vanilla region of them all. Kanto doesn't really have any diversity in its geography the way other regions do, and while it certainly does have some interesting locations to its name, it just doesn't measure up to the large variety of landscapes that we see in regions today. As mentioned, this isn't really the fault of Kanto itself, as it was simply a victim of its time as the very first Pokemon region, but if I had to give a worst thing about Kanto, that's what I would say. I also considered putting glitches here as the worst thing as well, but many of the Gen 1 Kanto glitches, like the Mew glitch and the Missing No glitch, actually helped the games to become more interesting and popular, and were not actually a hindrance at all. So yeah, the overall vanilla nature of the region is what I'm gonna go with for the worst part of Gen 1. And now we come to another best part of the video, thanks to none other than our boy Fulkachi. Fulkachi is my mascot, who is now available in plush form, and thanks to so many of you lovely, amazing people who have picked one up, I've been able to continue making videos just like this one for you all to watch. But not only does Fulkachi help to keep the channel going, he's also extremely soft, squishy, and overall just an amazing high quality plush that is pretty next level as far as merch goes. And on top of the plush, you also get an amazing Fulkachi promo card from the upcoming Histrobi Chronicles trading card game with every order. This card is pretty amazing as well, and it won't be made available anywhere else, but you can get it for free simply by ordering a plush, and as mentioned, it makes all the difference in helping my content to keep happening, and it also supports my bigger projects as well, like the Histrobi Chronicles video game that I'm currently working on. So go grab yourself a Fulkachi plush at histrobishop.com. That link is in the description below, and a huge thank you to everyone who has picked one up so far. And now, let's get on to our feature presentation. Gen 2 is up next, and its best feature is a no-brainer. The ability to travel through 2 whole regions in the Gold and Silver games is a gold standard of Pokemon that even 25 years later has still yet to be topped. I know there are those that don't have that much praise for this, but for me personally, getting to go to Kanto after going through Johto and seeing how everything had changed due to the 3-year time jump was one of my greatest all-time gaming moments ever, Pokemon or otherwise. The only thing that is even in the same category for me in terms of a wow factor for Pokemon is Legends Arceus, but otherwise, the Gold and Silver 2 region system is a pinnacle of Pokemon achievement that will always be one of my most cherished gaming experiences. On the worst side of things, however, there are some popular criticisms that come to mind for this sort of thing with Johto, like the leveling system, but I personally don't agree with that, and that's a discussion for another day. So for my worst thing about Johto, I am going to say that it is the use of new Johto Pokemon. I don't so much mean things like the other classic argument that Houndour and Murkrow can only be found in Kanto despite being Johto Pokemon, because once again, I don't really agree with that specific argument, but that is once again a discussion for another day. Instead, what I mean by this is that the Johto Pokemon weren't really utilized to the best extent that they could have been in Johto itself. Most of the gym leaders, for instance, don't even use Johto Pokemon, even though they're Johto gym leaders, or at most, they only have one of them. Like, for example, Falkner is a flying-type leader, but doesn't have Hoot Hoot on his team, which can literally be caught right outside his gym, or Bugsy, being a Bug-type gym leader, doesn't have a Johtomon on his team, despite both Lediba and Spinarak existing. I could go on, but that is something that definitely could have been improved on, and if we ever get another Johto revisit in the future, that has definitely got to be one of the very first fixes that they make, in my opinion. Gen 3's best feature is another example of Pokemon at its absolute best, and that is the execution of Hoenn's legendary and mythical Pokemon. Nearly every one of them has some kind of cool quest or awesome method of obtaining them. Groudon and Kyogre have the awesome Drought and Flood sequences, Rayquaza has the Sky Pillar, the Regis have the Braille quest, the Lotties are roaming Pokemon, and even Deoxys has a cool event quest and the amazing climax of the Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which is technically Gen 6, but you get what I mean. Jirachi, meanwhile, is the only one out of this entire group that does not have some kind of top-notch quest connected to it, but for every other Hoenn legendary to have a unique, challenging, and flat-out awesome method of obtaining them, sets the example for exactly how legendary Pokemon should be treated, and no other generation has done it better, in my opinion, than Generation 3. Generation 3 was just great overall, in fact, so much so that I don't really have something that sticks out to me as the worst. So for full disclosure, I'm kind of just picking something for the sake of it here, because Gen 3 is pretty dang great overall. But if I did have to single something out, I would say that the worst of this generation is the Pokemon contests. While it was a new feature introduced in Gen 3, it never really interested me that much personally, and I think it is also somewhat telling that the contest halls outside of Lily Cove City were immediately replaced with the battle tents in Pokemon Emerald. It almost felt like contests were being phased out before the generation in which they were introduced was even over, which is kinda sad to think about. So if I did have to pick something, contests would be my worst part about Gen 3. For Gen 4, I have two things I want to mention in the best department. First is a similar point to what I said about Gen 3, and that is mythical Pokemon events. While it is a similar category to the Gen 3 thing, Gen 4 absolutely set the standard for mythical Pokemon events and how good mythical Pokemon can be treated. We've pretty much been begging for that level of quality to return ever since, and we actually ended up getting it recently with the Pecha Run event in Scarlet and Violet, so hopefully it will prove to be a more regular thing going forward. And along with the mythical events, I also had to mention Sinnoh's starter Pokemon, because in my opinion, Sinnoh has the best starter final evolutions of any generation, and it, in my opinion, was the last generation to this point where the final starter Evos were really just absolute fire as an entire group. While generations after this do still have great starter evolutions like Greninja and Decidueye, who are also some of the best starter evolutions ever since Generation 4, there have also always been one or two duds in every starter group, in my opinion. Whereas with Sinnoh, all three of the final starter Evos are just flat out great, which is a huge deal that honestly deserves a lot of praise. And I can only hope that starter Pokemon and their evolutions can return to this level of greatness in the future. The worst part about Gen 4, meanwhile, is its speed. While Platinum pretty much fixed this, the slow pace at which Diamond and Pearl move has actually been enough at times to deter me from wanting to go back and play those games, which is a shame because otherwise they're amazing. We have all seen the memes where it takes 5 minutes for Blissy's HP to run out, but genuinely, it can feel like an absolute slog at times to get through these games and their super slow pacing, even if you're really enjoying your playthrough. So that has got to be my worst feature of Generation 4 in what is an otherwise pretty awesome generation. Now we're on to Gen 5, and the best thing about it for me is another thing that is one of the best things in the entire series, and that is the introduction of sequel games with Black and White 2. Ironically, the Generation 2 games were also sort of sequels with their connection to Kanto, but Black and White 2 were the first, and so far the only, direct sequels that we have seen in main series Pokemon, and boy oh boy was it a treat. Those games took Gen 5 from being the absolute worst for me to being among my top 3 to 5 games in the entire series. They improved on everything that Black and White needed improving on, while also having an amazing sequel storyline that had me gripped from start to finish, and at the time, it was the closest to that feeling of absolute awe that I had felt playing Pokemon since I had first played Gold and Silver, and that is all the more impressive considering where this generation began for me, which was pretty low on the totem pole, and a big reason for that is due to what I consider to be my worst thing about Generation 5, its Pokédex. This obviously isn't a unique criticism, but many of the Gen 5 Pokemon aren't quite up to snuff for me personally, and a good amount of them are also just genuinely bad, and with them being the only Pokemon in Black and White before the post-game, it just left a really bad taste in my mouth that actually had me wondering at the time, even if ever so slightly, if Game Freak had actually run out of ideas for Pokemon. While there are some amazing Unova Pokemon as well, that is the one thing that turned me off about Generation 5 for a while, and overall, I feel like it still probably has the worst batch of Pokemon of any generation. Meanwhile, however, we are now on to Generation 6, and its best feature in my opinion is its new Pokemon. And while I think that Generation 5 introduced the worst set of new Pokemon of any generation, it was and still is my belief that Generation 6 introduced the best set of new Pokemon that we've ever seen a region introduce. In fact, I feel like Kalos's Pokemon are almost a direct response to Unova's, since Unova's introduced the most with their quality being a heavy criticism, while Kalos introduced the fewest new Pokemon of any generation, a record which it still holds to this day, and at least in my opinion, so many of them are absolutely phenomenal. It felt much more like a quality over quantity type of situation this time around, and while it does have a few duds of its own as well, which are just always going to be there, the dex by and large is fantastic in Kalos in my opinion, and is one of the reasons why I love Kalos a lot. And that doesn't even consider the Mega Evolutions either, which really just goes to show how good Kalos's new Pokemon really were. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows in Kalos, however, because this region definitely laid an egg with its rivals. The Kalos rivals are widely seen as the worst rivals in the entire series, and I would have to agree, as none of them remotely bring anything substantial to the table. Tierno and Trevor are basically throwaway background characters. Shauna is alright as a companion character, but never really comes close to feeling like a true rival. And then the opposite player character to whoever you choose, who is effectively your main rival, just never really felt compelling enough to redeem what was lacking in the other characters. So even though I love Kalos as a whole, I cannot deny that its rivals stink pretty bad. Generation 7, like other generations before it, introduced an all-time great feature, which is easily the best thing to come out of this generation in my opinion, and that is regional variance. In a day and age where we never see features like this last more than one generation, the fact that regional variants have been going for 3 generations at this point and are fairly likely to continue on past that even further just goes to show what a monumentally good and popular feature this has proved to be. It's a perfect fit for Pokemon, and I can only hope that we get to continue to see new regional variants for a long time to come. For the worst part about Gen 7 though, is something that I believe is probably the worst of its kind in the whole series, and that is this generation's enhanced version. While I don't think it can be argued that Ultra Sun and Moon are indeed more optimized versions of Sun and Moon by definition, as enhanced versions go, I think they still left a lot to be desired. They felt nearly identical to Sun and Moon right up until the very end of the game when you finally got to the Necrozma stuff, and the major changes that they did make, like with Lucamine's character for instance, weren't exactly welcome, because I for one really liked Lucamine the way she was in Sun and Moon a lot more. And while Necrozma made for a great villain as well, it just felt like Lucamine's character got botched a little bit in the Ultra games. And even when you did in fact get to the big new addition in these games, which was Ultra Megalopolis, a literal extraterrestrial city on another planet populated by actual aliens, it amounted to nothing more than just a hallway that led to Ultra Necrozma. This place easily could have been one of the coolest locations in all of Pokemon if it had actually been just fleshed out a little bit more. But the signature area of this game ultimately coming up that short was pretty representative of the game as a whole, and it just doesn't quite measure up in my opinion when compared to the yellows and the crystals and the emeralds and the platinums and the black and white 2s of the Pokemon world. Generation 8 is both an interesting one and an easy one to talk about the best of the Generation 4, because this time it is the entire game of Pokemon Legends Arceus. As I mentioned earlier, this game is the only thing that has been able to match the kind of jaw-dropping awe that I felt when playing Gold and Silver for the first time and got to go to Kanto, which is a high that I had been chasing in Pokemon ever since Gold and Silver first released about 20 years prior. This game is everything that I have wanted modern Pokemon to be, and for it to come out during a generation that was filled with so much controversy and criticism following Sword and Shield's release, it was also an extremely glorious breath of fresh air that the series really needed during one of its darker moments. For those reasons, and for the bold, new, and interesting direction that it took the series, and for the legacy that it is now also putting into place with Legends ZA following it up, Legends Arceus is currently my favorite Pokemon game, and is one of the best things to ever happen to Pokemon, period. It wasn't all this glorious in Generation 8 though, as we have already mentioned, and while I could talk about some of the bigger things from this generation for my worst pick here, like the Dex cut, personally, that didn't really bother me that much. I was actually way more bothered by the final evolutions of the starter Pokemon than any of the controversies that Sword and Shield had going for it, which is why they are my worst thing about this generation. In fact, the final Evos of the Galar starters are the worst final starter Evos ever to this point in my opinion as well. For one, the fact that they're all monotyped is a bit of a bummer. It's not like it's an outright bad quality, but it was definitely a disappointment to see that none of the Galar starters gained a type upon evolving. And then, when you couple that with their designs, it just made these starters go from bad to worse. In my opinion, none of these starter evolutions have a good design. Rillaboom, while not bad, feels too basic for a starter in my opinion, and I'm also not a fan of it carrying a drum around everywhere it goes either. Cinderace implemented the concept of a rabbit soccer player in just about as uncreative of a way as possible, and its design just feels way too basic and even a bit uninspired. And Inteleon, while parts of it have grown on me over the years, is still way too humanoid for its own good, and when a lot of the enjoyment of a Pokemon game rides on Pokemon you actually like and want to use being in the game, which is especially important for your starter Pokemon, not even being able to enjoy your starter Pokemon is a tough pill to swallow, which is why they are my worst pick of this generation. And last but not least, we come to Generation 9, and for my best pick here, it is basically a tie between the open world and the game's plot and story. These two are kind of tied together since the flow of the story revolves around the open world to a degree, but I really enjoyed the open world of Scarlet and Violet overall and how it was utilized. It was super fun to be able to explore an open world in a Pokemon game, and I really enjoyed how they integrated the story into the exploration of the region with the 3 different paths of the story that you could take, as I felt like it really filled up the world and constantly gave you different things to do and reasons to explore the entire region, and being able to do it in any order was also really fun as well. Likewise, the plot of this game was absolutely phenomenal. Discovering Pokemon that come from the distant past and far future in the single best location in any Pokemon game, and spoilers, you find out that they were brought here by the region's professor who was killed by the game's box art Pokemon, and the professor that is standing before you in the game is a freaking robot and the parent of your rival who was also basically abandoned his entire life thanks to his parents' research, makes for what is easily the best plot in any Pokemon game, and I don't think it's even close. Stuff like this that pushes the envelope a little bit and also gets creative at the same time is exactly what I want to see out of Pokemon games moving forward, and I think as far as stories go, that Scarlet and Violet definitely set a new standard for what we can expect the plot of a Pokemon game to be. However, Scarlet and Violet were not this good in every department, and something that bugged me the most about them was the inability to go inside of most buildings. This feature, if you can even call it that, has been around since the very first Pokemon games and has never wavered, and exploring the buildings of every town is honestly one of my favorite things to do, because you never know what you're going to find inside them. Scarlet and Violet, however, almost removed the ability to do this entirely, with the exception of a select few buildings like your house, the professor's lab, and the academy. The only reason that I can think of why this would have been removed is due to time constraints, unfortunately, as it probably took them a bit longer to build the open world, which probably took up all the time that they normally would have had to implement indoor environments, and if true, that is a real shame, because it ironically took away a lot of explorability in a game that is supposed to be the most explorable Pokemon game ever with its open world. So yeah, that is what I didn't like the most about Gen 9, and hopefully that'll be remedied by the time Gen 10 rolls around. And those were my best and worst parts of every Pokemon generation. Be sure to let me know yours in the comments, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and thanks a bunch for watching. You can check me out on Patreon if you'd like to further support the channel, or listen to my Pokemon remixes wherever you get your music, which is greatly appreciated and supports the channel a ton as well. And with that said, I'll see you guys soon with another video. Thanks again for watching, and until then, as always, I will smell you guys later.